Irene Bloemraad, who is someone who studies identity, citizenship, immigration, is going to make the case that you are actually your citizenship. And I think she's got a broad definition of what citizenship is. Irene is a Canadian who now resides in California, where she's an associate professor of sociology at the University of California. She studies the nexus of immigration, politics, and national identities. Please welcome Irene Bloemraad, who will answer the question, who are you, by making the case that you are your citizenship. An interesting thing on a day like today, isn't that? Irene?
If you ask Canadians their sense of belonging and their pride in a Canadian identity and in being Canadian, 9 out of 10, roughly, residents of Canada say that they feel like they belong to Canada and they're proud of being Canadian or a resident of Canada. Now, that's an incredibly high number. Like, think of what would happen if 9 out of 10 Canadians agreed on taxes, or 9 out of 10 Canadians agreed on environmental policy. And that number is even more remarkable when we think that about 1 in 5 Canadians was not born in this country. So one of the remarkable things, I think, about that statistic is that not only does it apply for people with long-standing roots in this country, but it also applies to people whose parents immigrated to this country and to people who have themselves grown up in another land and moved to Canada. And so what I think that does is it gives us an opening to ask, what is it about the Canadian context that allows us to even answer this question, I am my citizenship, in a way that 9 out of 10 Canadians will more or less agree that I am Canadian. So if you look at what constitutes Canadian identity, this is based on a poll that the Environics Institute did in 2010, you find that healthcare is really prominent, that over 80% of people answering this survey said that healthcare is strongly associated with an identity as Canadian. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a significant source of identity, or something that reflects Canadian identity. The flag and the national parks. And the interesting thing about these 4 items that are sort of topping the list, I think, is if you cast your mind back 50 years ago and you imagine what people might have answered to the question of Canadian identity 50 years ago, at least 3 of these 4 wouldn't have been there because they didn't exist. Now, why is this important? This is important because when I said that these people who are polled in these opinion polls responded these ways, these are all residents of Canada, which, as many of you probably know, includes about 20% of the population of Canada that was not born in this country. So you have a very significant foreign-born population that was born somewhere else, maybe spent some years growing up there, come to Canada, and then they respond in ways that are very similar to these responses of all other Canadians who were maybe born in this country. Why does this matter? In the context of identity, over the last year especially, we've been having lots of debates around multiculturalism and pluralism. And many of you might remember back in October, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, she made headlines when she pronounced that multiculturalism had utterly failed in Germany. She was not the only one. Nicolas Sarkozy, the president of France, made similar statements, and just a few months ago, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, announced, or he stated that state multiculturalism was a problem, that even if Britain, respected diversity and thought it was a good thing, the government should not be involved and instead should embrace a muscular liberalism in its place. And Canada has not been immune to this. The Globe and Mail came out with an editorial that followed up on a series that had been doing, and as you can see here, the Globe's editorial said, multiculturalism should be struck from the national vocabulary. Canada needs to have the courage to build a successful society around the concept of citizenship. A lot of people are wondering whether the increased diversity that comes with immigration, diversity of language, of cultures, backgrounds, races, ethnicities, religions, whether that diversity is undermining citizenship. Does more diversity mean less citizenship? And citizenship here understood as cohesion, common projects, common endeavors in the future. And one of the central arguments of my research is that policies around pluralism, diversity, multiculturalism, rather than presenting that as a zero-sum trade-off, more diversity, less citizenship, actually bring those two things together and allows diversity to become a benefit within the context of citizenship so that we have common citizenship. Now what I want to do is I want to give you a little bit of evidence from some research I did based on a Canada-US comparison. And so if you look with using census data, comparing the proportion of immigrants, foreign-born individuals, who take up either Canadian or American citizenship across the 20th century, so across the sweep of that century. From about 1900 up to 1970, they're pretty similar. But following 1970-71, something remarkable starts happening. The Canadian numbers keep inching up. More and more immigrants take out citizenship, and the US numbers drop. Immigrants in Canada over the last 10 to 20 years are much more likely to take out Canadian citizenship than American citizenship. And this really speaks that I think the answer to the question of identity and who we are in the Canadian context, citizenship is very, very important. So one of the things that you find when you look at sort of immigrants in the United States and Canada is immigrants in the United States and Canada both have a similar perception of social inclusion and also the challenges of social inclusion. So in both Canada and the United States, a lot of immigrants, especially in big cities, will say, you know, this society tolerates and even recognizes my background. I can be Vietnamese Canadian, I can be Vietnamese American. And so on the ground, the social reality is similar in the US and Canada. But when it comes to the political standing of those minorities and their ability to advance political projects, or even just to say, hey, I'm here, you know, think about me, and can you please speak to some of the issues that are dear to my heart, in Canada you have more of that incorporation than in the United States. Public policy influences our notion of citizenship, our notion of membership, and our notion of standing in a society. So what's really important, I think, to highlight when you ask when I answer the question, I am my citizenship, is I am highlighting I am a reflection of the policies of my government and the policies of my society that give me a sense of who I am in that society, and that's sort of bundled together under the label of citizenship. The other reason that it's important, though, is that I think citizenship, especially in democratic countries, is extremely important to give people the sense of power that they can make changes to their society, and citizenship is an important way for us to mobilize identities to do things in the future. Fundamentally, integration into a society is about the social connections we have. Those social interactions, and it can be with organizations, it can be with community leaders, churches, religious organizations, etc., they facilitate that process of citizenship. And so I'm going to give you some examples of that in a second. That infrastructure, the supportive infrastructure of community organizations, is fundamentally helped along by things such as settlement policy, integration policy, multiculturalism policies. So the policy infrastructure provides a foundation upon which immigrant communities can mobilize themselves. They can do their own things, they do their own stuff, but especially for immigrant communities that might not have the same resources, might not come with a lot of financial capital, might not come with a lot of education because where they came from, they didn't really have the opportunity to go very far. They really need sort of this seed money, let's say, to help them get integrated and also get on the path of citizenship. And then finally, the final point I'd like to make is that public policy, it's important for instrumental reasons. Having a room available for people to meet so that they can talk about something in the local library is fundamentally important for helping this process along. But it's also the symbolic notions behind policies. The policies in place obviously do things. They give money, they build, they do technical things, they set up regulations, but those policies also, in the minds of people, represent things. And if you want additional evidence beyond the immigrant case, just think of that first or the second statistic I showed you about healthcare. Who would have thought that someone's identity as a Canadian would be linked to whether you have health insurance or not? But clearly that is the case in Canada. So policies carry these identity components with them, which then builds this bundle of citizenship. I interviewed Doris Meisner, who was the commissioner for the Immigration and Naturalization Service when that still existed under the Clinton administration. She is probably one of the INS commissioners who were most dedicated to citizenship. She wanted to put the N back in INS. She was going to put naturalization at the forefront. It didn't work out that way. She actually started the increase in the border control in the United States. And when she reflected back on her time as an INS commissioner, she said, the dominant culture of the agency is rooted in a view of immigration as a source of security and law enforcement vulnerability more than of continued nation building. Currently in the United States, immigration and naturalization services are within the Department of Homeland Security. And just by the name of that agency, you can imagine that that hasn't really changed. In the Canadian case, I interviewed some senior officials at Citizenship and Immigration. I took a sort of standard American line and said, why are you using taxpayer dollars to do all of this citizenship stuff? And the woman I spoke to got quite upset with me and said, why would we not encourage citizenship? We say everyone belongs, that we believe in diversity. When we promote citizenship, let's be clear. It talks about applying, yes, but at its beginning, it's about integration. And this kind of attitude, immigrants get this. They understand what's going on. So with an interview that I did with a Portuguese-American woman who was low income in the Boston area, she was complaining about rents. And she said, but they, the government, don't know how it is. You can't say, sir, send the people that care about the immigrants, because they are the people who can't speak up. There is nowhere to complain to, and we can't complain. So very much a feeling of being shut out. In this other case, Joe was a really interesting person because he had deep attachments to Portugal, and he actually held both Canadian and American citizenship. And I asked him, well, you know, who are you? I guess I asked him, who are you? You know, what are you? And he said, I'm Canadian. And I said, well, why are you Canadian? Why not these other things? And he said, well, I like the way the government runs things. I guess the great support, the multicultural stuff, the social assistance. We pay a lot of tax, that's true. But the great concern of government, the help for the citizens themselves. And so he felt much more included in government and in the citizenry. So when, you know, you can imagine Joe having to answer this question about, do you feel you belong? And he would be one of those 9 out of 10 residents of Canada who would say, yeah, you know, I do feel like I belong.
You know, fundamentally, my research is saying that public policies matter when it comes to immigrant incorporation into political systems and into citizenship, and that those public policies have to provide both instrumental supports to immigrants so that they can become part of society and be active in civil society, and it has to provide a sense of symbolic citizenship and a sense of symbolic openness to who they are and where they come from. And in countries that are able to bring both support to immigrant communities and settlement assistance together with this message that we recognize and we appreciate you, in those countries, immigrants are more likely to participate and more likely to be part of the things that we think of as citizenship in terms of participating in local schools, running for office, getting together with others to solve problems, and even taking to the streets to protest when they don't like what's going on.
If you look at perceived discrimination, the unitary countries, those are countries that really try to have a unitary notion of belonging. Immigrants in those countries are more likely to perceive discrimination. So they're more likely to see discrimination vis-a-vis themselves compared to the pluralist places, the places that have more diversity policies, more open citizenship. And if you ask about political trust, trust in political institutions, trust in politicians, the ones who are in the more pluralist societies are more likely to feel more likely to feel trust in those institutions and politicians than the ones in the more unitary societies, or the societies where the notion of citizenship is very unitary. But I would also argue, to get back to the very first point, public policy really matters in constituting our identities, and in the Canadian case, it's an identity that does have important links to public policies, not only multiculturalism, but things like healthcare, national parks, etc. And then the answer to who we are is we are a citizenship. Thank you very much.